It's a pleasure for me to introduce our next speakers. Dr. Timothy Haney is an associate professor of sociology and director of the Center for Community Disaster Research at Mount Royal University. He specializes in the sociology of disaster, environmental sociology, and urban sociology. His research focuses on how families, neighbors, and communities prepare for and recover from disasters such as floods, hurricanes, oil spills, and wildfires. And Dr. Carolyn McDonald-Harker is a sociologist and assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and a faculty affiliate of the center at Mount Royal University. And her research areas include family, parenting and parenthood, children and youth, disaster, trauma, and resilience, and the intersections of gender, race, and social class. And they're here today to share with us some of their recent research initiatives here in Alberta. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I guess I'm going to go first, and thank you all for coming. I came here today afraid that I was going to walk into a room and there'd be 6 people sitting here in sort of an empty room. This is incredible. This is bigger. This is Woodstock compared to the crowds I usually talk to, so this is great. I'm going to talk to you today about the 2013 flood here in southern Alberta and what happened research-wise as a result of the 2013 flood here in southern Alberta, and in particular at Mount Royal University. So I'm going to talk about the Center for Community Disaster Research at MRU and kind of how it came about and how it developed. So when the 2013 flood happened, and you'll hear more about the 2013 flood if you're not terribly familiar later in our talks, it was clear there was a need for collaboration and a space for discussion about disasters, resilience, emergencies, emergency management, all sorts of related issues. And I knew this right away because there's a whole story behind this, but basically my son was born during the 2013 flood, and he was a home birth because of the flood. And immediately afterwards, I was getting calls from media outlets saying, can you do an interview about this? Can you do an interview about that? I was getting calls from people in organizations like Red Cross and AHS saying, what do you know about this? What do you know about that? As it turns out, I didn't know at the time, I'm just about the only disaster sociologist in Canada. There's maybe 3 of us, depending on how you define that. Carolyn is now one too, although Carolyn didn't do disaster work before the 2013 flood. And so when you're the only show in town, everybody calls you when a disaster happens. And what I kept saying over and over was, I don't know. I haven't slept in 3 days. I have a new baby at home. I don't know. But everybody was clamoring for a place to have integrated discussions. People from social work backgrounds, psychology backgrounds, sociology backgrounds, economics backgrounds, all sorts of folks wanted to talk to each other. But the space didn't really exist. And so I kind of became the broker of those folks, but didn't really know how to handle it. There were questions about gaps in best practices in disaster situations. There was a clear need for information in the Canadian context because most disaster research comes out of the US context, and actually the majority of it is very hurricane specific, especially the stuff regarding evacuation and things like that. A lot of it comes out of the Gulf Coast, which doesn't always apply to the kinds of disasters that we have here and across Canada. And we needed to develop local expertise on disaster risk response and recovery. There's already great expertise locally in organizations like CEMA, the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, but in universities, it didn't really exist as much. So we needed to develop some of that. But I had lots of questions as we started to think about developing this place, which is, how do we fit with existing disaster research centers, which are by and large in the United States? What do we do that's different? What do we offer that's different than these places? And I didn't know. What does a disaster research center look like at an all undergraduate university? We don't have the benefit of the expertise of graduate students like a lot of places do. So what does that look like? How does that function? Is it possible? Will diverse community partners, and I listed a few of the folks we've worked with in the past, and faculty members share enough of a common language and a common vocabulary to talk to each other? I didn't know this either. Does the emergency management profession really want another disaster research center? This, of course, was a big unknown as well. And will funders think that what we're doing is worthwhile? Will there be return on investment for potential funders who want to contribute to a center like ours? And finally, there was practically nobody other than me at Mount Royal doing disaster work at the time of the flood. Will people want to, or is it going to be constantly, trying to push what's the saying about trying to push a mule up a ramp or something like that? Do people want to do disaster research at the institution? Do they have the resources to do it? I didn't know any of this stuff. Fortunately, a number of funders came to the table, the two biggest ones being the Calgary Foundation and SHIRK, which is our federal funding agency here in Canada. They came to the table and supported us, which was great. So we created a mission statement, vision statement. You can read all of that here. But basically, we're trying to be a trusted broker of information and a connector of parties related to disaster research and disaster knowledge and practice in Canada. This includes research, teaching, and outreach. And we view the end users of research and our community partners as meaningful partners who inform us throughout the process of doing a research project. We're hoping to contribute to community resilience, of course. So we wanted to increase scholarly activity around disaster, both at Mount Royal and in Calgary, to generate knowledge and create programming that will protect people from hazards and help them recover when they are affected by a disaster. And we envision MRU as a Canadian hub for disaster research. I didn't say the Canadian hub because there's other places doing the work too, but certainly an important hub in, as you all know, Alberta is a place that unfortunately has a black cloud over us. We've had 3 very costly disasters in the last 5 or 6 years, and so this seemed like the right place at the right time for something like we wanted to do. So we developed a core staff, which included me, the director, an office manager. We brought on board 13 faculty affiliates. Both Julie and Carolyn are. 10 of them are from Mount Royal and work at Mount Royal. 3 of them are external. A number of community partners and student research assistants. Best I can figure, we've employed at this point through our projects about 50-ish undergraduate and graduate, but mainly undergraduate students as research assistants. So that's been a success. We run a small grant program to get projects up and running. We did a quick response grant for the Fort McMurray wildfire and launched several projects related to Fort McMurray and the fire. We run seminar and brown bag events, a big fall lecture every year. We support externally funded projects however we can. This includes hopefully projects like the ARC project, which Carolyn and Julie will talk about. That's a project that's externally funded, but if we can do anything to support and help those projects, we certainly try to do that. And we're planning a big event on May 16th, which we're calling tentatively Resilient YYC. That'll be on the Mount Royal campus. We're going to have, it's a TED-style event where we're going to have 10 short talks on issues related to disaster and resilience. There will be more information coming about that very shortly, like next week. What do we do with community partners? Because again, the session's about making connections. We co-author reports with them, which we've done on several occasions. Our students work with various organizations as volunteers when they need labor for things like collecting data. Our students have helped with those sorts of things in the past. We host folks from community partner organizations as guest speakers. We pursue their ideas in our research project, and we envision them as end users of our research. Hopefully what we do can inform practice for people on the ground. So here's some examples of some of the stuff that we've funded or have given support to. So this includes things like a peer support and mentoring project in Fort McMurray, teaching children in Calgary Board of Education schools about disasters and disaster risk, a study of pet evacuation from the Fort McMurray wildfire, which has drawn a lot of attention in recent months because many people had to evacuate without their pets, of course, and that was a source of stress and trauma for many people. So in less than 3 years, the center has carried out more than 17 distinct research projects, either that we funded or supported in some way, held 14 events, hired and trained more than 50 student RAs, produced more than 20 publications. Many of them have been co-authored with students or our community partners, presented at more than 30 conferences and workshops. 2 student theses have come out of our projects, 14 media interviews, 6 videos, and I've taken 2 of my classes of students to New Orleans to learn and to work with local organizations there to serve the community as students learn about recovery from Katrina and the BP oil spill. So there's been lots of successes, which has been really great to see, and the impact has been hopefully quite significant. One example of that is I spoke in April of last year with the Emergency Social Services Network of Alberta. They had their annual meeting in Calgary, And I talked about learnings from what we learned from the Calgary Flood Project, which I'll talk about briefly here in a minute with you all. And then within 2 weeks or whatever it was, ESNA was mobilized to work in and around Fort McMurray, as well as evacuation and reception centers around the province. And I was getting emails from them saying, hey, we're actually using some of the stuff you talked about. We were actually able to apply what didn't go as well as it could have in Calgary to now Fort McMurray. So that's great. But I got an email from ESNA during the height of the Fort McMurray fire saying, what do you know about resident reentry planning? Like, what can we do better to make sure when people come home, whether the homes have been affected or not, that all the social and psychological supports are in place? And what I said, what I thought initially was, I don't know, that's not really the area that I work in. But what was great is that I had the center now. So we mobilized a team of 9 faculty affiliates, 9 of our faculty members, and 5 student research assistants to, within 24 hours, crank out a report for the Emergency Social Services Network, to email it up to them, which they immediately printed off several copies of, read, digested. It went all the way to Darby Allen, who was the fire chief in Fort McMurray. He read it, and it had a significant impact on how reentry planning was done. So this was this is an example of how this sort of structure didn't exist before the 2013 flood, but now that's in place to be able to have an impact when future disasters happen. So we're excited about that. Okay, I was also asked to talk about one specific project that I did, and I'm not going to talk about it very long because I'm probably over time already. So what I will say is I was funded by SSHRC to do a project on evacuation decisions, displacement, and the use of networks, not social networks like Facebook, but oh boy, is that for all of us or for me? Okay, good. Oh, I'm good then, don't worry. I won't take that long. During the 2013 Calgary flood, so how people use their neighbors and friends and family to find places to stay, secure resources, and so on during the 2013 flood and the evacuation. A little bit about the flood. It was the costliest disaster in Canadian history. Damages exceeded $5 billion, as most of y'all know. And it resulted in devastating impacts affecting social, economic, health, and environmental infrastructures. So what I asked was, what were the experiences of Calgarians through the temporal arc, meaning from beginning to end of the flood? Warning, evacuation, displacement, and eventual return. Who did they rely on? Where did they go? How did things like gender, income, and ethnicity matter? I'm a sociologist, so I care about inequalities. Other people do too, of course, but that's one of the core interests of our field. And how did the flood change their views on various things? Including their environmental views, which was kind of a side interest of mine. So we randomly selected 1,500 households in 26 neighborhoods. We mailed a survey to all of them. I was working with a team of student RAs. For the people who didn't respond, my students visited on foot all of the houses that didn't respond, and they dodged lots of angry dogs in doing that, and were told many, many times, get off of my property, and those sorts of things. So, but in the end, we had a final survey data set of 407 residents. We did in-depth interviews generating qualitative data with 40 flood-affected residents as well, creating what's probably, maybe, possibly the best data set in existence on the 2013 Calgary flood and how people experienced it. These are my student RAs. That's what it looks like to mail out 1,500 surveys. We had a whole room full of full of mailing supplies and such. But the students are amazing, and they do fantastic work. So some findings coming out of that already, which hopefully we'll be able to connect with our community partners about, and hopefully this will be interesting to some of our community partners. One finding that's been published already is that men affected by the flood were less likely than women to say that their environmental views changed as a result of the flood, and I mean like 70% less likely. So that was a significant and interesting finding, that women's environmental views were more likely to shift after experiencing an environmental disaster than men's were. Men talked in the interviews about being worried about economic concerns. You couldn't ask in the interviews men questions about their environmental views without them immediately shifting to the issue of energy, and I'm worried about my job, and the economy's not very good right now, and so I can't afford to be more environmental, is what men told us. So we've already published some of this stuff. But we also found through this project that many flood-affected residents were not aware prior to the flood that their homes were at risk. And we're talking about like it was almost half of people in flood-affected neighborhoods, but even among people who flooded, it was like 20 or 30% of people were not aware that their home was could potentially be flooded. Many residents who were asked to evacuate did not evacuate at all, and only 10% who were asked to evacuate evacuated within 2 hours. So there was a significant information gap there. There were issues of trust that played into it. There were lots of different reasons for that, which we can talk about later if you want to. About half of people who evacuated did not lean on family or friends to find a place to evacuate to. They found places completely on their own and didn't use their social networks and relationships to find places to stay. About 20% say the flood had negative impacts on their marriage. About the same percent said that their children have exhibited negative impacts as a result of the flood. This was a year after the flood. 20% felt their usual routines were disrupted, even a year later, and almost half found it upsetting that familiar landmarks were damaged or gone. So it's the disruption, what's often called the disruption of their ontological security, or their feelings of safety and stability in their environment were disrupted. Only half who returned see themselves as living in their flood-affected neighborhood after 5 years. The biggest predictors of whether they did or not were civic engagement, how involved they were in their community. That seemed to be a route that increased the odds that people were going to stay in their neighborhoods, the number of neighbors they knew, and the assessment of their neighborhood quality. So all of these things mattered for whether people saw themselves in their neighborhood after 5 years. Income, not so much. And even whether or not people flooded, not so much, which was quite interesting. Among those wanting to leave their neighborhoods, 24% listed fear of future flooding as the main reason that they wanted to move out and live somewhere else. Not the majority. The majority wanted to move for other reasons, but still notable. So I want to talk about a few of the things that we learned from the Calgary flood. It's incomplete in this talk because there is so much more that I could say about it. I'm happy to have a conversation with you. If you want to get hooked up with the center, in particular to learn about what's going on at the center and to learn about our upcoming event in May, you can get on our email list by emailing ccdr@mtroyal.ca. You can follow our Twitter @disasterccdr. We have a Facebook page. You can find our website at mtroyal.ca/ccdr. Or you can contact me. My information is here. My email is there and my Twitter handle is there. So you can get linked up with us in a number of different ways. And I would love to connect with you guys, so thank you. I should have introduced you better. And this is Carolyn. I should have introduced her better. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you, Tim. So I'm actually going to talk about a project that emerged from the 2013 flood entitled The Effects and Implications of Environmental Disasters and the Family. And with this study, we looked at communicating, coping, and caring among families impacted by the 2013 Southern Alberta flood, but specifically in High River. So for those of you who are not local, the town of High River is a small community, just about 30 minutes or so, depending on how fast you drive, outside of Calgary. And this was a town that was hardest hit by the floods in 2013. At this time, all 13,000 residents were evacuated and were not allowed to return to their homes for several weeks, which was very different than what took place in Calgary. A lot were allowed to return within just a few days, but not in High River. 59% of the land was inundated by water. Over 70% of the homes were affected by water, and 95% of the buildings were moderately to severely damaged. So I have a few photos here to sort of show you the extent of the flooding. As you can see, those vehicles are not parked, they're actually floating. And the town could only be accessed by boats at the time. So High River families were particularly impacted by the flood and experienced significant disruption in their family lives and routines because a lot of these families faced severe damage of their home, their places of employment. Many worked in the town of High River, children's schools, recreational facilities, family spaces, including parks, and even access to resources such as childcare. And what we saw in the aftermath of a flood was certainly among several service providers, sort of a sort of loss in terms of not just a physical loss, but a lot of service providers were at a loss with how to deal with the flood. I live sort of just outside of the town of High River, and I remember just a month after the flood had occurred, when, you know, people were starting to re-enter the community and their homes, that many were coming to me saying, well, you do sociology of the family, what can you tell us about floods? And as Tim mentioned, at that time, I had not done any disaster research. And the provincial government had given some funds to Bow Valley College in High River, a local community college, to sort of help the community rebuild and recover. Because even for the province, as well as for Canada, this is something that not many had ever really dealt with, the extent of the disaster. As Tim mentioned, this was at the time the costliest disaster in Canadian history. And so I began by offering a few workshops in terms of how families can recover post-flood, talked a little bit about PTSD, talked about emergency preparedness. And at these workshops, I was surprised by how many individuals had attended. But what was even more surprising to me was the number of service providers in attendance. I thought, you know, this would actually be family members coming. But after the workshops, I would have dozens and dozens of service providers, many of whom were social workers, saying, what can we do? We've not really been trained for this in our line of work, and what can we do to help? And so, you know, I scoured the literature and I would look for what past research had done. And after about a week or so, I finally said, you know what? If we really want to know how we can help families best, then we need to ask them. We need to do research in this area. And so I approached Dr. Haney and said, you do sociology of disaster and I do sociology of family. Do you want to collaborate and do a study on this? And of course his response was yes. And so we applied for and received funds from SHRC to carry out this study. So it's a 3-year study that directly emerged from a need from the community and through collaborations between academics and community service providers and organizations. So certainly this is a project which is still ongoing, that is community situated, collaborative, and action oriented, and certainly brought together a lot of service providers in the area. So we actually started off with only 6 community partners who you know, came to us and wanted to be part of this project because, of course, they wanted to know that information in order to inform their current practices and policies and resources. And so we actually, in the course of just a few months, ended up increasing our partners from 6 to 12, just in terms of networking and letting other community organizations know that they can join in on this project, with the ultimate goal of us sharing some of that knowledge and information with them. So there's a list here all the way from Alberta Health Services to the public and Catholic school divisions, family and community support assistance, Foothills Community Immigrant Services. So there's a list here that you can see of the community partners. So essentially with this project, what we wanted to look at was how family life was altered by the disaster context. And what's really interesting is a lot of research, at least in the sociological area, focuses on specific individuals within the family as opposed to looking at the family as a whole. So it sort of look at parents, or it would look at children or adolescents. So with this project, we would really wanted to look at the overall family context. We also wanted to look at how experiencing a disaster influences family interactions and relationships, not only with inside the family and the home, but also outside, and also how families manage and function during and after disaster, and how they can best be supported post-disaster. So a few of our research questions, essentially to summarize them: how did the flood impact couple and spousal relationships in the family? How did it impact some of the parent-child relationships? How did it impact the division of paid and unpaid labor within the home, and what that looks like? Because as most of you know, that changes significantly in situations of disaster. How did it impact the family school life, family school dynamic, family school relationships, and what issues, problems, and difficulties the flood either created or heightened or influenced for families post-flood, how immigrant families in specific were impacted, and what were the primary needs of the family post-flood. And so what we decided to do in terms of research methodology was hold 8 separate focus group interviews with a total of 46 participants. And these were conducted with key community service providers in High River. So we had a separate focus group to represent, for example, the school boards and immigration services or Alberta Health Services. And then we also conducted 105 face-to-face interviews with parents who live in High River and who had children under the age of 18 years. And we had initially started off with, the idea of, well, maybe, we'll interview 60 parents, but the response was so tremendous. Many of these parents themselves wanted to share the experiences of their families, not only as a way to sort of contribute to that information gathering, but also in the event that another flood or, as all of you know, the 2016 wildfire would occur. So a lot of them said, we're going through this and it's difficult for us, but if we can sort of share what we've learned and that can have an impact on other families, then we are willing to do that and give of our time. And so the analysis of the focus group data is now completed. Analysis of our face-to-face interviews is still ongoing. And as I mentioned earlier, the purpose of this project was for us to gather this information and be able to provide it to local as well as provincial and even national community service providers who directly work with families. And so, this was a shift that we had to make as academics because, as most of you know, we tend to publish in academic journals that maybe 2 or 3 people in our area may read, but we wanted our impact to be far much more reach a further audience than that. So we started off by putting together a summary report that was 54 pages. And when we, gave that to the community partners on our project, we realized they really don't necessarily want to or have the time to read 54 pages. So that was sort of a learning process for us. And so as a result of that, we also created a research snapshot that is 3 pages. I'll sort of show you what that looks like, which is just much more easily digestible and that can be shared among other service providers. And then, of course, we did a variety of different presentations, community presentations, a few academic presentations, also roundtables with our service providers. We have a Facebook page where we're trying to sort of disseminate some of those research findings, and also a website that can be accessible to the public, as well as any individuals who are interested in accessing these resources. So this is sort of the 3-page research snapshot. I won't go into too many of the details. I can share this with any of you, but essentially what we did was summarize some of those research findings looking at employment, and what we found was the family was significantly impacted when it came to paid and unpaid work, and as we heard earlier this morning, that also women tend to perform the majority of the unpaid labor and even revert to traditional gender roles post-disaster, and we certainly saw that. We saw that in terms of intimate relationships. Many of the couples experienced conflict, largely due to not only the stress of experiencing the flood, but also due to lack of privacy. A lot of them were not able to even return to their homes for months. They were uninhabitable, and they were staying with other individuals, and often had a lack of privacy. In terms of parent-child relationships, we saw that a lot of adolescents in particular were really sort of forced into more adult roles, if you will, and took on a lot of responsibility out of lack of choice, essentially. And a lot of parents felt a little bit of guilt for that, and also felt guilt that, they weren't able to be with their children every single moment because they were trying to remediate and rebuild their homes. Family-school relationships, we certainly saw that the schools stepped up quite a bit and took on not only the role of teacher, but even in many cases the role of parents, and provided a lot of the counseling within the schools. A lot of the schools were not, come September, they were not able to go back to the school, so they were, in recreation centers, that sort of, or buildings like that. In the meantime, really close in gyms, one on top of the other, and so the teachers ended up doing a lot of work outside of the curriculum that they have to present. So there's some other findings there I won't go into too much detail. But now I want to talk about another project that sort of emerged out of some of these collaborations. As Dr. Haney mentioned earlier, the center was created within the same year as this project was launched, and certainly provided a great opportunity for us to collaborate with other individuals on other projects. And I want to talk to speak about one of those projects that is entitled A Peer Support and Mentoring Pilot Project for Community Service Providers and Youth in Fort McMurray, Alberta. And essentially with this project, we're looking at developing collaborative support for community resilience and disaster recovery. And this is a project that both Julie and I and another colleague, Dr. Robin Cox, are involved in. And it's actually a project that is funded by the Center for Community Disaster Research and also involves several of the community partners who are on the other project I just mentioned and are now affiliated with the center. So it allows us to sort of further develop some of those connections that we've made, not only on some projects, but other projects that are existing and future projects. So as most of you know, in 2016, last May 4th, 2016, the Alberta government declared a provincial state of emergency and issued the mandatory evacuation of approximately 80,000 residents in the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo and Fort McMurray. And of course, the wildfires, most of you probably saw it in the media, it caused monumental damage and harm to the province, the city itself, and its surrounding forestry and infrastructure. And it surpassed the cost associated with the 2013 flood and is now the costliest disaster in Canadian history. So here's a few photos here to sort of show you some of the extent of the damage, some residents who are trying to evacuate. And as a result of that, based on the Alberta Resilient Communities Project, which Dr. Julie Drolet will speak to shortly, we worked with several community partners who, in the aftermath of the 2016 wildfire, certainly expressed a desire and an interest to collaborate with, lend support to other service providers in Fort McMurray. And so they indicated to us, you know, we have a lot of experience. We just went through a major disaster 3 years ago, and we feel that there's lessons learned that we can certainly share and perhaps aid in the recovery of the community. And so this project as well is certainly community driven, and it's a one-year study that attempts to better understand community resilience through a peer support and mentoring pilot project between two disaster impacted communities in Alberta, so High River and Fort McMurray. And so, as I mentioned, it definitely emerged as a response to community service providers who expressed a desire to reach out and engage with other service providers in Fort McMurray. And of course, as I mentioned, it's funded by the CCDR, and it's a project that we're just launching right now. And so the main research questions is essentially, how can local communities with disaster recovery experience contribute to resilience building processes in partnership with newly disaster affected communities? And based on past literature and research, there's not a whole lot that has been done in this area. You know, every time a disaster occurs in Canada, it's almost as though we say, okay, what do we know? We look at it within its own context. And there certainly is, and we believe there are benefits to having communities who have experienced disasters work with one another. And so this is a pilot project that we're currently conducting to see what ways the sharing of disaster knowledge, experiences and lessons learned, not only between community service providers, but also youth, can help with that resilience building post-disaster. And so what we're planning on doing with this project is utilizing a qualitative research methodology where we are going to be recruiting 5 community service providers as well as 5 youth from each of the communities who are going to take part in this peer support mentoring pilot project. So for a total of 20 participants, and they will be paired and matched in each community and then engaged in a 6-week online program. And we're hoping that the findings will be able to provide important and useful information to help not only the resilience building initiatives and recovery within these two communities, even though one was in 2013. We know that rebuilding after a disaster occurs many years after, whether it's 5 to 20, but also the recently impacted community of Fort McMurray. And we're hoping that it contributes to knowledge about the role and the effectiveness of a peer support program. And we don't know what this is going to look like. And we're certainly assessing that within this project, as opposed to, sort of having researchers go off and do their thing and provide their findings. We're hoping that this project can help build knowledge about what connections and peer support and mentorship between individuals who are the ones who are directly impacted by disaster, and whether that is effective or not. So now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Julie Drolet, who's going to speak about another project that we're working on.
So I'd like to share with you some work that we've been engaged in since 2015 called the Alberta Resilient Communities Project. And its focus is on engaging children and youth in community resilience post-flood in southern Alberta. And this project is funded by Alberta Innovates. So as you may know, children and youth are particularly affected by disasters. And I'm sure that many of you as social workers and service providers understand what we're talking about when we say that children and youth experience certain risks or vulnerabilities and various factors that relate to their developmental stage, where they are at their life cycle, and a number of structural vulnerabilities. So we've undertook this 3-year collaborative study to better understand some of the factors that contribute to resiliency among children and youth, while empowering them and the adult allies in their lives and communities to look at enacting resilience building strategies. Our research team brings together an interdisciplinary group from sociology, psychology, and social work, including academic researchers, community partners, a number of government stakeholders, and many service providers. We've organized ourselves into 3 streams of research with a lead in each area. I'm leading the community influencer stream, Carolyn is leading the child focus stream, and Dr. Robin Cox of Royal Roads University is leading the youth focus stream. We have 10 academic partners, 20 community partners, and steering committees made up of service providers and various stakeholders, as well as a youth advisory. So this is quite a large collaborative research initiative. These are some of the questions that are driving our work. How are children and youth included and excluded from processes and practices intended to enable the resilience, mental health, and well-being post-disasters? What are some of the policies that can help promote this? And how can families, schools, and communities best influence and support the mental health, well-being, and resiliency of children and youth post-disaster? I'd now like to share with you some of the work of the community stream. I'm going to be very brief, but here all day to answer any questions. And we also have a website where we're starting to include some of the findings. In your packages, you'll also find some infographics that present some of the preliminary information from our research findings. So the community influencers are service providers who are located in community organizations, social service agencies, nonprofits, immigrant serving agencies, schools, includes social workers, and we're interested in understanding how their work in the delivery of services and programs enhances resilience for children and youth. So to date, we've conducted 37 interviews with a number of participants in flood-affected communities in southern Alberta, and these are some of the 6 themes that we've begun to identify in our preliminary analysis. We see the importance of pre- and post-flood services, that exist in the community both before and after an event, and the importance of long-term recovery. And I think that's a theme we're going to continue to hear more about today, that a lot of resources are put into the short to medium term, maybe 1, 2, sometimes 3 years after an event. But we know that there is a need for ongoing supports. The importance of community connections and relationships, the nature of the social service workplace and how that plays an important role when we think about capacity, self-care, and well-being of the workers themselves who are delivering these services. We're also seeing in social work practice an increasing emphasis on trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practice, and this is also important in the context of disasters. The need for policy and the inclusion of youth voices. Many respondents spoke about the importance of including youth voices in these processes, but were less sure about how actually to do that and what kind of processes or structures might facilitate the inclusion of those experiences. And then finally, the need for rural mental health and wellness. This is an ongoing issue in many rural and smaller communities in Alberta, and certainly is magnified after a disaster event. In January, we organized a paint night activity for children and youth 10 to 16 years of age in collaboration with the Boys and Girls Club in High River. It was an art-informed framework that allowed us to conduct some conversations with youth as they were painting, and we also administered the Child and Youth Resiliency Measure, which is a survey designed here in Canada by a social worker, Dr. Michael Ungar, who leads a resilience research center at Dalhousie University. So looking at, again, a community-based, and in this case, an arts-informed research activity that was also identified by the community to look to increase diversity and voices. Carolyn, would you like to present on some of the findings from the child stream? Thank you.
So some of the key child research activities were framed around a variety of different questions that we wanted to examine with this project. And first, we wanted to look at how children's lives are impacted by the tragedy, the stress, and of course the upheaval of the conditions of disaster. We're also looking at how children demonstrate resilience or lack thereof when they're directly faced with these circumstances of disasters. And we're also looking at what the cumulative internal but also external factors are within their lives that are related to resiliency in situations of disaster. So if you look a lot of the psychological research focuses on the individual themselves when it comes to child resilience. But with this project, we're taking a broader approach, and we're looking at that social context in the life of the child. So we're also looking at the impact of family, school, peers, and community support systems, with the end goal of looking at what resilient strategies can be used to help contribute to the development of child's resilience in disaster situations, and certainly help contribute to increasing their overall adaptation, recovery, and health and well-being. So for this stream, we utilized a mixed methods approach, so a quantitative component that, as Julie mentioned earlier, we're administering the CYRM, and also a qualitative semi-structured component, which consists of semi-structured interviews, 66 open-ended questions to contextualize the CYRM, and that sort of measures the individual and personal skills, peer support, social skills, caregiver relationships, and their overall context, education, community, etc. So far we have interviewed 79 children, as well as 79 parents and legal guardians in southern Alberta for a total sample of 158, and many of the participants are from various areas in southern Alberta. And in terms of some of the emerging themes from our preliminary findings, is that we're noticing that child resilience is due to a variety of factors, and I'll discuss those really quickly. So what we found is that individual child responses and their ability to adapt to a post-flood environment often is related to some of the roles and responsibilities that they have post-flood. And what we found is that there's increased resilience when children have a positive rather than a negative response. So the flood is viewed more or less as an opportunity versus an obstacle, and as something, a learning process, if you will, as opposed to a limitation, and an experience that can provide growth as opposed to a setback. And we also found that adaptation certainly involves direct and active involvement in flood recovery. So if you see, in disaster situations, we often tell children, oh, you don't need to help out, or maybe we'll send you to grandma's home in another province, because we think that we're protecting children by not exposing them to the disaster environment. and to the sort of those recovery processes. But we found quite the opposite in this project, that often children were more resilient when they were able to contribute to community cleanup, when they were able to help with siblings, when they're able to be directly involved on the ground, and of course in a safe way. We also found that parental response, coping, and communication skills post-flood certainly had an impact, and we found increased resilience when parents themselves responded constructively to the flood, when they, of course, were less stressed, less anxious, worried less, and then communicated this to their children. We often see, that parents think, well, if I don't express the stress that I feel to my children, I won't cause stress for them. But children are very perceptive, and they see when their parents are feeling that way, and so what we found is that it's certainly useful for parents to be open and communicate this with their children, and to have reciprocal response strategies where parents sort of share what they're experiencing and how they're feeling in the aftermath of a disaster, but also ask their children about their emotional, psychological, and physical coping. Just because children appear to be doing okay on the outside does not necessarily mean that they are, and sort of avoiding those conversations is not something that contributes to their resilience. So having open, honest, and clear communication between parents and children. And then also active involvement in immediate support networks with their schools, peers, even sports and recreational programs. And we found that children felt supported through important social institutions where they have day-to-day interactions, and that this certainly increased their resilience capacity. And also when they're actively involved in disaster preparedness responses and recovery, as opposed to being a passive presence. And then finally, we found that a close awareness and ability to make connections between disasters and the environment had an impact on their resilience capacity, and that there was increased resilience when children are able to identify, conceptualize, and link disasters to human environment impacts, so to climate change. So, in the face of a disaster and dealing with the circumstances post-disaster, a lot of children, of course, feel anxiety because it's something they don't have control over. But when they're able to identify something that they can have control over, that increases their resilience. So lots of kids mentioned, contributing to reducing climate change. So trying to recycle more, trying to help out at home, and reduce emissions by perhaps encouraging their family to walk or ride their bikes as opposed to driving. And that certainly helped children have a greater sense of control over their own environment and future risk exposure.
Before we complete our presentation, we'd just like to share that we've been successful in obtaining some new funding that's going to look at the health effects of the Alberta wildfire with a focus on pediatric resilience. So this is specific to children and youth. And the funders are CIHR, Alberta Innovates, and the Canadian Red Cross. And we've just recently learned about this within sort of the past 6 weeks or so. And this will be a 2-year study that looks at a number of factors to better understand, again, what contributes to resiliency. We're looking at individual characteristics as well as a number of social and environmental factors. And the team includes a number of psychiatrists who are researchers at the University of Alberta, as well as Carolyn and myself, who will be leading the qualitative component. We also have a number of partners who have joined this team, so we're quite excited to be able to work together across the disciplines to investigate some of these questions. We're using a mixed methods research approach that's a bit complex. It has 5 different phases, and some of them are overlapping, beginning with some quantitative population health data. Phase 2 will be led by Carolyn, where she'll be using the CYRM measure and some open-ended questions, aiming to conduct 100 interviews with children and adolescents. I'll be leading interviews with community service providers who also play a role in fostering community resilience and understanding child and youth resilience. Our 4th phase includes a group-based qualitative approach using applied theater with a playwright from Vancouver who will be coming to Fort McMurray and to Alberta to lead us in some applied theater workshops with children and youth and also with community members. And then lastly, focus group interviews with community members to see what their perspectives are on the preliminary data before we start to circulate that more widely. So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to the presentations this morning. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, so perhaps I could open that up now if anyone has any questions or comments up here at the front.
Hi, thank you for all of these presentations. It's quite exciting. In my past, or in my life, the one organization that tends to and has done disaster in the past is the Red Cross. The Federation of the Red Cross globally, as well as Red Cross, as you know, with the Red Cross, each country has their own Red Cross Association or whatever. So I'm not seeing the Red Cross here. And I'm wondering are they partners, or are you doing something totally separate from the Red Cross? Or can anybody kind of let me know what is happening as far as this whole initiative? Is the Red Cross even a partner?
We can talk about it. As far as the center goes, people from the Red Cross. This is going to be really brief. As far as the center goes, people from the Red Cross do come to our events from time to time. Some of our former students have gone on to work for the Red Cross, so there's been an exchange of ideas. Have they been a partner on a specific project? I don't think so, no. No, and it's certainly, important for me as a center director to have them involved. Usually, though, I gotta say, my job has been more squeaky wheel gets the grease, so whoever I see the most and hear the most is who we end up working the closest with, just because creating a disaster center in a crisis and a recovery from a crisis, it ends up being crisis management. So I don't know what to liken it to, but I always say that I'm the worst director of a quite successful center that I've ever seen. And the reason is, I just try to keep my head above water every day. And so the strategic planning has sort of fallen by the wayside, which is to say there are people who could be organizations that could be great partners that we just haven't forged as strong a relationship with as other ones. So that would be a direction to go in. But yeah, I don't know if you guys want to talk about it too.
I think as we spoke about, a lot of these projects were based on individuals, community organizations who have approached us, and that's perhaps not necessarily something that has happened yet from the Red Cross, other than being a funder on one of our recent projects. Having said that, I think that a lot of the work that we do, because it is academic in nature, even though we're disseminating those findings, our intention is to definitely emphasize the dissemination of those findings within organizations that can actually use them, that perhaps some of our areas don't cross over as much, where they may deal with issues like emergency management and evacuation and the gathering of funds and then the disseminating of funds. And I think that's perhaps why they're not often at the table, but not to say that they're not important resources and organizations that could benefit from our findings. And that's why we try to make them as public as possible with social media sites as well as websites, and then providing directly to community organizations reports and summaries of our findings. Does that answer your question a bit?
I think it would be really important. The Red Cross internationally has prepared. They have so much information, and they've done all this internationally, and it feels like you could be at risk of reinventing the wheel, so to speak. I would encourage you to I didn't realize that they were funders of one, and that's great, but it just feels like they should be part of this. Yeah. So I just leave it with you. That's my own comment.
Yeah, I could say that in the Rebuilding Lives Post-Disaster project, we conducted research in British Columbia related to the 2003 wildfires and and a landslide event, and the Canadian Red Cross, but a local provincial office in British Columbia was a partner on that initiative. But I think it really depends on the focus of the project, what the question is, who are the stakeholders, and if you're looking to have an impact in a local community, you know, we need to really think about who really needs to be at the table. And so I don't think we can say blanket-wise that certain stakeholder groups need to be a partner in every project. It really depends on the specific question and what it is that you're looking at. Because there are lots of stakeholders in this field. Red Cross is certainly one of them. St. John's Ambulance is another. Samaritan's Purse. There's lots of NGOs and organizations active. We might have time for one more question just before we break for lunch. Okay.
Hi there. This is really rather a comment rather than a question. I saw your presentation at the recent AEMA Stakeholder Summit, and for those of us that aren't familiar with Alberta Emergency Management Agency, fantastic group of emergency management folks that are action-oriented. This people stuff sort of throws them. So, like, truly, I could see people's heads kindly exploding with some of the concepts that were shared with regards to resiliency in children and so on. So it's really exciting to see how this Fort McMurray piece will then impact and inform this group, because there's no going back. This hopefully will occur at other instances within the province, and will continue to push the research forward and expand the people element of it, because of course we're doing groundbreaking work in Canada here in Alberta with the Provincial Emergency Social Services piece that was implemented at this last disaster with Fort McMurray. So I think with your findings and the new research and the information that we're able to move forward with, we'll be able to continue to lead the country and maybe even internationally with regards to this pieces. So fantastic work, and look forward to the research findings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if we have any questions from the webinar. Oh, it's loading. Okay. Well, maybe what I could do is thank the webinar participants for joining our morning session. We are going to be concluding the webinar now. So thank you very much for connecting with us. And the webinar is recorded, and the recordings will be made available on our websites, and also the PowerPoint slides that you've seen this morning. If you're interested in getting copies of those will also be made available. We're now going to break for an hour for lunch. So please come back for 1 o'clock, and our afternoon is going to be quite interactive with e-prep session and starting to talk about building a network. I'd also like to invite our morning speakers to come up, please, because we'd like to thank you, and invite Howray and to come up so that we can thank our speakers, and we'd also like to gather for a photograph. So thank you all very much. I know it was a lot of listening. We will be moving more this afternoon, and look forward to connecting further with you over lunch and during the breaks.